Thanks for coming. I'm talking about reactive responsive design, like you just said. My GitHub is in GM87. There's some random stuff up there. Often it's for talks and things like that. And then my Twitter handle. But let's just jump into it. Reactive responsive design. So first, I wanted to define what responsive design is. And that is UI that reacts to screen size. And that may be that you are resizing a screen. Maybe someone's hitting Windows left and shrinking it to half size, or it's someone on a phone versus someone on a laptop versus someone on a tablet. Our applications should really be able to function well on any of those devices. Responsive design typically depends on media queries, and whether you are writing the media queries yourself or you're using a library or Bootstrap or whatever, those are using media queries as well. You just don't have to interact with them. But as you get into more and more custom stuff, you're going to have to be doing something with media queries for responsive design. The problem is media queries are kind of a mess. I run into a lot of people that are like, whoa, wait, what are you talking about? We've been using these things for years and years. But those people are always people that know media queries and use them a lot. Not people that are like, oh, I'm just having to start using them and this is not fun. So I'm going to talk about first what makes media queries a mess. And then we'll move into reactive responsive design and how that solves these problems. So the first thing is that there's a lack of defined organization. There's kind of a conflict on how a lot of people want to organize the classes versus how media queries help you organize the classes. To give you an example of this, if we look over at this code, this is an example. This is a Sass file, but it's valid CSS file as well. Media queries support nesting. I have 5 media queries defined here. And this is just normal media query syntax. And you'll see that we have this size as a title class and another one class. Same with the rest of these. So these classes only apply to the element when the screen is that width. The problem with this is if you are digging into some bugs or anything like that, and you run into, hey, I want to look at the classes that affect the title. Well, this CSS file, depending on the size of the component or whatever, could be 1,000 lines, something like that. Especially if you have a lot of breakpoints, it gets like larger and larger and larger, and so then you find yourself searching for like dot title and then like skipping around a 1,000 line CSS file. Not super ergonomic. I see other people, and I don't like this either, where they repeat the media queries but group the classes, right? So that they can be like, okay, here's all my title classes. Here's all my another one classes, but now you have what I'll call media query bloat, where you're adding a bunch of lines just for these media query things. It's easy to put a different breakpoint in there and have some weird stuff happen. So this is maybe more ergonomic for a lot of cases, but readability is down. Lines of code doesn't win there either. So how are you supposed to organize it? Well, you probably end up doing the first one, but you might be a little annoyed trying to go and address issues in your CSS. Next thing is different queries. If you're working on a large team, you have a bunch of developers, and maybe you work on like a top bar and a side nav or something like that, and someone else does main content on a page, and you guys are using different breakpoints. You might have some weird UI states where you're converting into like a mode for a smaller screen, but they're still sitting on a larger screen. And it doesn't always happen, but it can happen. And so ideally, you have a way to avoid that by having it codified what your queries are, rather than just depending on people picking those out in a code review or something. The next thing, and this is something I hear a lot of people struggle with media queries is that it only queries the screen width and some other things like orientation, but you can't watch an element, you can't watch for a group of elements. It's only screen size. So that limits the kind of views you can make with just media queries. You have to start resorting into things like, okay, I'm going to use the framework to decide whether this stuff shows or doesn't show, and I'm going to use media queries to decide whether this stuff is styled differently than this other stuff. And it'd be nice if you could just depend on like one way to lay out your screen rather than juggling how you want to handle that. Next thing, and this is one that kind of bothers me, is that the components always load. So media queries will hide elements when they're not supposed to show. And that's not super ideal because if you think about it, what's the smallest size device that someone's going to use your app with? It's a phone. What's also the lowest performance device someone's going to use your app with? That's also a phone. And so if you have an element that requires a lot of data or something, but that component doesn't go on a phone because either the UI for it doesn't adjust well to a phone, or you're just like, our mobile users aren't going to need this information. If you're just using media queries, that component is still going to generate and be hidden. So you have to do some extra stuff to say, hey, let's not pull this data, or like I said, wrap that in a if in your template or something, so it doesn't show up. And the last thing is media queries are hard to test. You have to resort to like end-to-end testing where you're checking element positioning or photographic evidence testing type stuff. I don't know what the technical term for that photo comparison is. But regardless, it's not super fun to test. So I started thinking, how can we unify this? How can we get to a place where I'm comfortable? Like I've done enterprise development my whole career, and it's really important to me to have like a standard that you can give people to follow rather than having to make decisions every time someone makes a pull request on, oh, are they doing this correctly? It saves me a lot of time, and it helps when you're delegating responsibility for that. So what do we do? It's something I had to think about quite a bit. Angular CDK set me in the right direction. If you're using Angular, I suggest looking into the CDK. But I wanted something that was framework agnostic so that, it'll work with React or whatever. And so I started digging into what I need to do to make something where we can pull our media queries out of the CSS and pull them into the JavaScript where we can get them into the reactive world. So I found this function on window called match media, and match media takes a media query as a string, and it will start watching for the media query, whether it's met or not. And then it has this function called add listener that you give it a callback function. So now we've gotten into a callback function. We can start triggering some changes with RxJS. So that's where this comes in. RxJS is going to save us. We're going to turn screen size changes into a stream. See, stream, and go from there. So the goal here is we want to track the screen size in an observable, and then subscribe around our app to detect those changes, rather than doing that logic in CSS. So I made a library. It's extremely simple. It's called RxRS for reactive responsive. And I'll show you what that library looks like so you can see what I did and see. It's very simple. I just did open source things so you don't have to go through the steps I did to figure this out. So 42 lines uncompiled, pretty short. But what it's doing is once you have a handle to this class, it has this observe function. You hand it a string of a media query, and it's going to return you an observable of type Boolean that will tell you whether the media query is met or not. So what I'm going to do, there's some minor optimizations in here. Like I have an object that holds mappings of the media query to the observable of whether that's met or not, so that if you pass in the same media query, you'll just get a subscription to the same subject that was already created. So if you come in here, if there's not a subject, we're going to add the listener, do this test query method to create the subject, and pretty simple. Now, after you see, okay, we have this RS thing, the next step is to make a size service. I usually call it window size service, but this screen does not show full slides, so I had to remove a word. So if we jump over to here, I'll show you an example window size service. And in Moment, we use this in all of our responsive design. We use reactive responsive. And we have a service very similar to this with more breakpoints. The stuff at the top of the class is just things to help with usability. So I have an enum that lists out the sizes I care about: extra small, small, medium, large, extra large. And I just use the Google material breakpoints to decide on these sizes. I have an interface for the object that's going to return out of this service that is just those sizes in the Boolean. I have an object for screen sizes that just makes it so I can programmatically decide what the breakpoint pixels are. And then an initial screen size object. Then in this class, in the constructor, I new up RxJS, and then I just observe the media queries that I care about. So I just go over these. So for extra small, if it matches, I'm going to spread over the initial screen sizes where all those are small, all those are false, and then set extra small to true. I do the same thing for each of these observations. I have another subject that is the current size. Some situations it's useful to just have a string of the size rather than an object that you like dot small on. So I support both those in this service. And in my production code, this is a little optimized. There's like a generator function to make these observes. But this works fine for an example. So that's a window size service. And with that, we've codified what sizes we're using and made a general shareable interface for that. So now we have a way to get observables of the screen sizes and a way to share those with our app. So let's start looking at how this is used and how this addresses the issues that I have with responsive design. So RxJS to the rescue. There we go. So the first thing is you decide where your code is. To show this, I'm going to jump over to here. And we are going to look at the title bar. So title bar, I use Angular because that's what I use day to day. You can do similar things in other frameworks. But in the templates, we can just use an async pipe here. And in Angular, the async pipe just grabs the latest value out of the observable and prints it in there. So we can say toolbar, and then toolbar dash, and then if the screen is extra small, you're going to see that as extra small. If it's large, it's going to get toolbar dash large. The CSS looks like this. So you don't have any of that media query wrapping anywhere, but you can group these however you want without any concern about how many lines you're going to increase this by grouping them or having them separate by whatever size screen it is. So you can decide that easily without repercussions on your readability. But here we have a base class to set the color, and then each of these sizes, it's going to be a different size. So I have this demo app here where we can see this in action. So you'll see that the title, this bar up here, will change sizes as I hit different breakpoints. There. So that'll jump around. And if we look at this element, you'll see that the title does switch sizes as we change around. So it's small now it's extra small, small again, medium. So we're dynamically generating these classes rather than saying in the media query, just use a different implementation of the class, if that makes sense. And we get to decide how we want to structure our CSS without having to worry about how that affects the media query, how the media queries lay out in the CSS file. And it's a lot cleaner without media query code in there at all. The next thing is you decide an app's breakpoints. And so this lands into that service again. If we look at the service, it's really easy. Initial setup is, we picked out some breakpoints. That's great. If you need to add a breakpoint or break these down smaller, you can come and update this. And you can have some helpers in here too, especially for like mobile. There's this is mobile state. So you can define like what you determine is a mobile size. And you could be at some point like, everyone is using like 7-inch phones now because they keep getting bigger. Maybe mobile state should be extra small or small screen sizes. And you can just, throw in an or here and say screen width dot small. And, oh man. And now your app everyone will just get that. Now your app will lay out for mobile devices at an additional size. And that can be pretty nice. So you can make different determinations on that. I have mobile and tablet here, but maybe you want large desktop. Maybe you don't use these defined small, medium, large, extra large distinctions, because then you can say, hey, we need to be more granular or whatever. And then you don't have to update any logic about, hey, this should lay out this way for this new size as well. You just enclose it into something like is desktop or something. And that has been a really big selling point at InMoment, is that, man, it is so nice not to have to deal with people using different breakpoints. And it's also a good subject when we have a large design group that designs all these pages. And sometimes they get really creative with how granular they want to be on those breakpoints. And we can come back to them and say, hey, these are the ones we support. If you want more, like, we can give you estimates on how much work that is. But it gives us like a point to push back that, hey, maybe that request is not well thought out. The next thing is you can account for complex layouts. And we're going to look at the demo of this first. And I've had to do layouts somewhat similar to this at InMoment, but we'll see how this goes. And while we go through this, try to imagine how difficult this is with just a media query. So as I get this smaller, you'll see these cards. This is CSS grid. And so this card is, let me see if I say this right, 2 columns, 1 row, 1 column, 1 row, 1 column, 2 rows, and then 1 and 1. But as we get smaller, we're going to reline those up. So these are now 2 columns, 1 row, each card is, because we're on a smaller device. And I'll make this bigger again. We have this side menu. And as we get smaller, you will see that these cards adjust that mobile view again as we get to a point where the layout is too constrained for the larger cards. With the side nav out. So this is already at a point where a media query in your CSS couldn't support this. As we get smaller, we'll see that drops away. Still the small menu now overlays everything. We have this filter thing, and I just said filters and put a filter icon. It looks a little weird, but it's what we got. As we make this screen wider, you will see, okay, mobile, now we're in the small view. Filters is here, and we're still seeing the smaller cards, just like we did when the side menu was open. As I get wider, we'll jump at some point to the larger cards. But if I open the side nav, we're going to constrain those cards again to that smaller size. So like all these interactions, you couldn't do with media queries. You'd have to decide, okay, we want to do the side nav with the media query maybe. Okay, we want the side nav to be full width when it's mobile, but normal otherwise. So that's easy to do in a media query. But then the cards, you'd have to start watching other things and not depend on the media queries. And that disconnect, again, can cause headaches because everyone is going to be implementing it differently. And 2, a lot of people just have to go and start digging and try to see. They'll try to do it with media queries and then have to revert stuff, and it all just takes time. So let's look at what this looks like in the code. When I'm doing a complex layout, I will often do something like this. I'll make an interface for my view state. So this is not the data going into the view necessarily. Maybe it is, but this is more like, this is the state that's required to lay out the view properly. And these are the things that I'm going to be setting depending on media queries or whatever else. So if I scroll up here, and again, there's some optimizations you can do to make this more concise. But because we now have our screen sizes in an observable, we can now combine that with other observables, right? And so if you look at this, I have this combine latest to make the view state, which is also an observable. And we have the window size service with the sizes. We have mobile state. And then we have these things out of our state service, side nav open and filter panel open. And with this, we can start making decisions on how we want the screen to lay out. So if we look here, if the size is extra small or it's small and the side nav is open, we're going to do those abbreviated cards like we saw for mobile. So right now we're in medium. Once we hit small and side nav is open, we now use these cards. And that's the same card setup as if we're in the full on mobile size. And then so that we're deciding the cards there, and we're deciding what class we want the filter to use. Extra small, I made it so it fills the whole screen just like the menu does. And then medium is where it just opens in the side only, really needed two sizes. And so we can start making decisions off of, combining our observables with the screen size into making what we want the view to look like. And so you can get as creative as you want. As long as it's an observable, it's easy to get in here and start making decisions on it as the screen changes or the data changes or any number of things change. And then the template stays pretty simple as well. So if we look here, we'll see things that we recognize like filter container and filter container getting that filter class. So this is the same dynamic classing that we had a minute ago. The cards are coming out of the same place, just the cards. And then you can ngIf on some things that you're getting out of there as well. Is the filter panel open? And some decisions like, is the filter class extra small? If you wanted to, and you thought, hey, this if statement is a little large, well, then just pull that into your view state and handle it in those if statements in the main class. So this is a much cleaner way to get a complicated interaction in that UI than the mixing up that you would do previously with, are we using media queries? Are we not using media queries? And things like that. And then components only load when needed. This is that performance issue I was talking about with phones. I was focusing specifically on phones, but we'll see as we get into one of these larger sizes, this is a big component that doesn't generate for mobile. If you were using media query, it would just hide it and it would still generate, and you'd have to decide how you want to handle that, whether you start wrapping that in if statements or what. But with this, you're going to use a if statement in your template and just not show it. And it's going off of that is mobile flag that is in our view state object. So with this, we're able to very easily make these UIs hide the things we don't want seen and just don't generate them. We don't need them anymore. Why generate them? And RxJS is, let me pull this up. I was going to show this a minute ago. Well, RxJS, you can use it very easily in anything. Where was I going? Here we go. So I'll just throw it on here. It installs very quickly. I meant to do this a minute ago, but I'll do it now just because. Because when I first did this, I was like, wow, this is actually working. And I've been asked, I want to bring in ng. Oh, my bad. On in it. When I first started doing this, some people would walk up to me and ask, they'd ask, okay, that's cool that you're watching that query on the window, but they use the like window size, so they watch the event for the resize, and then like, okay, get the window size and do something with it. But the downside of that is you don't get other media query options. Like you can't watch portrait or landscape. You can't. There's several things you can't watch, and it's a lot easier to kind of. There's already a syntax around media queries, and that syntax is easy to look up. If you made something else, you'd have to be like, okay, I want an argument of like the start pixels and the end pixels, and track it that way. So finding that you could just use media queries and use the syntax that's easy to find and known was pretty cool, because you can just copy your media queries out of your CSS, move it into the observe function, and it just works. Do this. The screen is really small on my computer. I guess I could look up there. And then if we come in here and do ng on init, oh man. If I could type, it's not an angle I usually stand at. And then we will just say rxrs.observe. And like I said, this is pretty cool. When I tried this out the first time too, is that I'll just look at my CSS file that I showed originally and be like, let's use one of these where it has kind of a start size and end size. And I can just copy that over. So you can just go look at your CSS. Oh, let's watch that one now. Subscribe to it. We'll say in for matches. And then I'm going to open this in a new window just because StackBlitz has a hard time when you start trying to grab the window because it's outside of that little Windows context or something. Anyways, so if I hit F12, we'll see when it opened up, match is false. Now it's true. Now it's false. Now it's true. Now it's false. So if you really want to, you don't have to use like service to wrap this. You can just start subscribing to it. You can use RxRS as the service, and just every time you request a media query size, if it already exists, it's just going to return you a subscription to that. I kind of like the service method because we generalize everything into that one thing. It helps with larger teams, but if it's just you or it's a small project, you can just throw on RxJS or RxRS and it'll just work. The last note I wanted to make is that you can test your layouts. Now, I don't have an example test, but it's just observables. You can do a marble test. And if you've done any testing with RxJS, you've probably dabbled into marbles because it's a lot easier than doing otherwise. But I didn't want to get into that too much. And it's not the same as having a like image comparison or validating that the DOM is the right shape. But what it does give you is it lets you see, hey, our state is a state that we expected with these values, our view state. Which is good. And then if you're using something like Jest, if you want to, you could also do a snapshot of the DOM to validate that the appropriate things are being set. And it doesn't get you quite to the image comparison, but it's a lot less overhead or from like comparing elements in your EDU test and things like that. So RxRS or reactive responsive design, however you pursue it, It seems like one of the next logical steps to me. You've got your state into reactive code. You've got like your data gathering into reactive code. Well, now it's like make the actual view reactive along with all of that, and it's just making your application more reactive and pulling that logic out of CSS, which like we heard a talk earlier. CSS, it's declarative and you can't really test it. It's hard to debug. Well, now you've got an observable. You can test that and work with that. So that's reactive responsive design. Hope you guys all enjoy it. And that's it.